All right. Afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Manga, for such a kind and wonderful introduction. Thank you all to the VCU community and this spectacular, beautiful museum. Actually, it's probably one of the more impressive buildings and spaces I've been in a while. So thank you for having me. And I'm excited to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing at the National Science Foundation, some of the things I'm excited about seeing in the future, and a bit about my research as well. So the talk I'm going to give, and I'll make my best effort to stay on time, is titled Broadening Participation and the Future of Research Innovation. So myself as a scholar and now a government, sometimes jokingly a bureaucrat, my research exists between the humanities and social sciences and the natural and physical sciences. And I'm interested in the big questions right now. We live in a world where the big questions, the ones I find most exciting, are bigger than one or two disciplinary voices. And they need a multitude of intellectual input to substantially change the way we think about that. And I think the future demands some new and unorthodox contributions and collaborations. And I think part of that is what I'm going to get at a bit. So it's good to talk to a group of people who are interested in how the humanities and social sciences can actually contribute to conversations about scientific and technological production and innovation. So let's begin here on this very large screen. Let's begin by talking about the mission of the National Science Foundation and the things I like about the mission. The mission is to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. So I think we're all very familiar with the first line, the promotion and progress of science. But I'm more excited about the second two, right? The advance of health, prosperity, and welfare, along with national defense, are about people, about people's lives and people's experiences and how they live in the world. So it's important to not think about the National Science Foundation as this juggernaut of producing the next set of innovative, transformative widgets and gadgets, but it's also invested in understanding how people live in the world and in this nation state. So my feeling is, when we think about it, to do better science, we need to think about how to make people's lives better. Continuing along these lines, we also want to think about how science and intellectual work takes time. We have spent a lot of energy thinking about speed, quickness, the return on investment, but we also have to understand that oftentimes some things that happen within intellectual productivity and production didn't initially come into existence right away. So a handful of years ago, we wouldn't have really thought about COVID, but COVID has brought us some really interesting endeavors when we think about science and technology. And sorry, I'm going backwards in slide land. All right, there we go. So first couplet is that the NSF's investments in PCR go back to the 1960s. This was eventually become a critical tool in understanding COVID testing. One of the innovative approaches that the NSF has supported is tracking COVID infections in wastewater, which allowed researchers to identify outbreaks before symptoms began appearing in communities. I think CRISPR is a relatively well-known technology, but it's interesting to think about it as a tool that enabled us to do rapid COVID testing. And then what's also interesting about this work is that the National Science Foundation and the division I direct also supports some very large-scale surveys dating back to the 60s and 70s, from the panel study on income dynamics to the General Social Science Survey to the American National Election Surveys. These are founded in fundamental and research-driven cognitive science and research, but this work gives us a baseline data necessary to assess and understand the enormously broad social, behavioral, and economic impacts the pandemic has on people living in the United States. And as I talk today, you'll hear me talking about people, people, and people again. I think it's central to the way we want to think about doing research. And when we think about these questions and these examples, they bring together how multidisciplinary research teams have helped us change the science and research that we're able to do in this country at the moment. So I'm also director of the Social Behavior and Economic Sciences, and in the division in this directorate. And the question is, like, what do we fund? What do we support? And so the SBE is the directorate. We support science that explores human behavior, social organization. We're asking about fundamental questions about human behavior, but SBE is also the home of government statistical agency that measures STEM in the United States. But if we look past those very clear understandings of what we're trying to say, I think that this directorate has a handful of values that I believe in, right? That one, science is a social endeavor. Science does not speak for itself. Social science is more than ethics, and social science helps us do better science. So I think those are some of the underlying and undergirding ideas that are shaping the infrastructure that I'd like to think about. And so, again, talking on behalf of SBE, just to give a background about how we're organized as an institution, we have the assistant director who is currently acting at the moment. It's Sylvia Butterfield, and manages the Office of Multidisciplinary Activities. And within there are three divisions: the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, led by Imelda Rivers; the Division of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences, BCS, led by Joan Sereno; and the Division of Social and Economic Sciences, that's led by yours truly. So what's interesting about, these are the main programs that we support through the funding of the Social Economic Sciences Division. Roughly, the division funds in the neighborhood of $100 million annually in these areas. But what's interesting that I'm intrigued about how this portfolio plays out is there are very few disciplinary programs besides sociology and economics. The rest are interdisciplinary in the sense that they're trying to figure out how to bring a broad base of communities together to think about the questions of the day. All right, so I began the talk by talking about the future and where I think the future of research may go and may happen. Currently, the NSF director is presenting the 24 budget to Congress. I think it's probably going on right now. And this year's budget has some things that I think are relevant to this conversation. So there are three main pillars: strengthening established NSF, inspiring missing millions, and accelerating technology innovation. So I think the two on the outside are really interesting. Me, I'm interested in this one in the middle mostly. And I'm excited because when we have the conversation about missing millions, it's about people. And I'm excited about the NSF stepping forward and saying, what do we do to think about the opportunities for changing the demographics and socioeconomic groups through this work? But again, as much as I love this, it's a solution, but I still feel we're missing potentially the larger question of why the missing millions are actually missing. And I think social scientists and humanists have a great deal to say about why the missing millions are not there. And I think part of the National Science Foundation has to tap into that scholarship and research that has been going on for as long as the National Science Foundation has been in existence to build some really important bridges between the intellectual domains and disciplines. So within those three pillars, there are a set of interlocking themes: advancing emerging industries for national economic security, building a resilient planet, creating opportunities everywhere, and strengthening research infrastructure. And again, I'm going to chop off the bottom and the top and focus on the two in the middle and the pieces that have me most excited about the two in the middle. So building a resilient planet, the language is that funding would focus on actions to meet the urgent demands of the climate crisis on people, places, and economies. So again, the National Science Foundation putting people at the center. So this question of climate crisis, clearly driven by humanity. The planet is pretty resilient without us. And if we would like to exist on the planet in the future, we need to think about our role in that and how humanity can, in a sense, ameliorate some of the damage that it has and will continue to do to the landscapes of the planet. Similarly, I'm intrigued with the Creating Opportunities Everywhere, where it says this whole of NSF strategy incorporates a directorate and office to surpass prior efforts and build on the concept of missing millions. Specifically, it focuses on expanding access and inclusion in STEM along individual, institutional, and geographic lines. I'm excited about the potential of broad diversity. It's just not about race, region, difference. It's asking the big questions. How do we do a better job collectively in thinking about diversity on the large scale? And what's important is that NSF can play a major role in how this all plays out financially. And so in thinking about broadening participation, this is why it matters. So this is the NSF's contribution to academic institutions and research in selected fields. So in social and psychological sciences, the NSF supports 63% of federally funded research. That's a big chunk. And so that's also a big responsibility, because at the same time, it is funded through taxpayer dollars. And as I assume most of you probably paid your taxes recently, this is a key component to where these dollars go. But again, this is kind of the way that our directorate lands plays out. Roughly $250 million in award obligations in fiscal year 2022, 3,500 proposals submitted and reviewed, 170 awards, about 22% funding rate. But let's get more specific. Let's ask about the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is the Virginia's numbers, right? Coming out of the state of Virginia, 85 proposals, 12 were awarded. And I believe the Center for Open Science is here at VCU. No? Maybe not. My mistake. Pardon? UVA. So I guess it's part of the reason I'm here. VCU doesn't have a strong profile in SBE sciences. So what does it mean for there to be a more focused and collaborative effort to contribute to this research? So yes, all this is freely available. NSF by the numbers. You can search all the ways that the NSF funds research. But back to the conversation about broadening participation. The NSF is trying to make inroads and change the way it funds questions about broadening participation. It has efforts to really push forward the broadening participation along many lines. And I'm excited about these efforts because it's trying to debunk some of the, I would say, familiar myths of the National Science Foundation, that the NSF only funds scholars at elite schools, it only funds famous academics. Once someone's declined, they're always declined. Advisory committees make funding decisions. The NSF is only interested in quantitative approaches. Qualitative and quantitative approaches are mutually exclusive, and NSF proposals must have hypotheses. There's a lot of bad advice floating around. So my suggestion is, if you're thinking about applying to the National Science Foundation, please contact a program officer, or more specifically, please contact me. Since I'm here, you know me, we're friends now, and I can direct you in the right direction, because I have friends and colleagues that these common myths have come from conversations I've had with them in the last year. And it's a very strange conversation where you're like, well, no, actually, that's wrong, let me fix that. So we want to think about broadening participation, and the NSF is doing better, right? So here are the numbers from efforts that the NSF is putting in focus programs and geographic diversity programs in broadening participation. So doing much better. Similarly, and focused research on funding minority-serving institutions. The NSF is continuing to hopefully do better and change the landscape of what's happening. But I think in talking about the future, and what I'm excited to talk about and believe to see the future, is that what does it mean to do something different than having a conversation about broadening participation, just getting more people into the conversation? So what does it mean to think about doing some science around the broadening participation? And so in the SBA Directorate, 3 years ago, under the then director, Kelly Clark Henderson, she started a program titled Build and Broaden, Enhancing Social Behavior and Economic Science, Research and Capacity in Minority-Serving Institutions. So the NSF has continued to fund projects that deepen our knowledge of how to broaden participation and an understanding of what works and why. But the problem is, where do we go next? And the next is the science of broadening participation, projects that differ in focus from many efforts to, in a sense, broaden participation. So right now there's a call out for Build and Broaden 3, which has 3 main goals: to expand the number of proposals submitted from minority-serving institutions, increase the number of partnerships and collaborative proposals between minority-serving institutions and non-minority-serving institutions. And the third is enhance research productivity, infrastructure, and capacity in SB sciences and minority-serving institutions. And so part of the question, and I think part of the impetus behind this, is that how do we change the landscape of who gets to do science? There are a lot of minority-serving institutions that are asked by other wealthier institutions to join them at the last minute in an effort to get large sums of research funding and small subawards going out to them. But what does it mean to ask those institutions to be part of the conversation from the beginning? That changes the landscape. So more specifically about the questions of broadening participation and doing the science of broadening participation, what have we actually literally funded to ask some of these questions? So I just want to give a handful of small examples of funded research that is addressing some of this work. So this is a project that's asking a question about women and their reward structure and retention rate around science. And the final outcome of this research is making the statement that women are and can be as competitive as men. So it's a question about competitiveness and their ability to compete. But this research that these scholars found that they prefer a reward structure that benefits groups rather than themselves, as in the context of scientific teams. So what does it mean for scholars and research to say that, well, we have all this effort and energy to produce collaborative research, right? That's the whole thing. We always need to collaborate. And what if women are more inclined to doing collaborative research because they are more invested in the research reward structure around collaborative work? Maybe we should have a lot more women in doing all of our work. So asking very potent questions about gender and difference. This is another project that's looking at questions about beliefs and stereotypes. And this project was really fascinating in that it asked the question about when you have tensions around groups, around racial difference, what happens if you have people who are not of one of these binary categories, blackness, whiteness? If you have biracial folks in the room, in the conversation. This research found that the shift in perception produced more positive orientations to members of other groups, more equitable and productive intergroup relations, and ultimately helped yield benefits that diversity offers. So, what does it mean to think about gateway individuals that break down the kind of racialized assumptions of how we exist in the world? So of course, if we've invested in this world where everything's in binaries, black, white, left, right, where are the graynesses that we all live in and exist in on a daily basis? And then finally, this is one project that I really like. It's about learning how to pronounce people's names. Right, so this project tests the effectiveness of new, simple, theory-based interventions to improve intergroup interactions, teaching majority groups members to properly pronounce ethnic names. When people cannot produce or remember a person's ethnic name, they feel embarrassed and tense. They avoid the ethnic name person, which then communicates the person does not belong. So very basic research of just saying, what does it mean to understand that we come from different parts of the world and that we should do better collectively. So these are some just basic, simple projects that I think are very important. The goal is to say the science of broadening participation is relevant to all scientific efforts and scientific disciplines and places. All right, so that's that piece. I'm going to pivot to the next piece and thinking about this question about broadening participation. And I'm going to move to a conversation about public access, which is happening right now that I think a lot of people don't realize is happening. So last year, Acting Director Alondra Nelson released a memo from the Office of Science and Technology Policy that calls for free, immediate, and equitable public access to government-funded research. The National Science Foundation just released its version of their report, and the idea that policy by 2024, implementation by 2025. The default zero embargoes of peer-reviewed articles and underlying data. This is a big one. So what does it mean, and how is the NSF working with this? Well, NSF has been developing a public access plan, thinking about equity of access, data sharing coordination, updating the PARs, outreach and FARO's Open Science RCN, trying to figure out what it means. And we've been doing a series of listening sessions, and I'm part of the working group. And part of what's interesting is what we've learned from these conversations is that there are certain principles and values. So those are presented here in a kind of difficult to read slide. So publishing is critical. Cross-disciplinary scientific work is important. And there's an important aspect of what it means to make science, information, and research openly available. And the goal is very laudable and a wonderful plan. But there are costs and concerns, right? There are heavy equity concerns. So what does it mean for scholarly communities where large research funds flow their way through publication? What does it mean about shifting publication costs to different forms of the funding and publishing ecology? And what does it mean to challenge questions about how we share data, reuse rights, a host of questions about what it means to do research collectively and collaboratively? And so we're trying to really lean in on the question of equity as a guiding priority going forward. So what does it mean to think about broadening participation and equity in the way we do and share research and knowledge? And it's really important. I think, yeah, the NSF is listening, but we have a long way to go to think about what it means to do open and collaborative science. And then Mangala asked me to talk at the last bit, a little bit of my own research. And in this idea of thinking about collaborative efforts and collaborative work, I'm part of a large group called the DISCO Network, Digital Inquiry Speculation Collaboration Optimism Network. I know it's a mouthful. And part of it is to think about what does it mean to build networks of scholars of color and difference. So here are all my co-PIs. And what does it mean to think about asking questions that allow us to push the limits of how we connect the humanities, the social sciences, the natural physical sciences? What does it mean to think about scholarly knowledge in a collective, collaborative way instead of the disaggregated way we've been pushing forward for a very long period of time? And so we're very thankful to Mellon for allowing us to bring together a group of interesting people, of scholars of color and difference, to really think about what it means to do work collaboratively and individually. And these are our labs at various different universities across the United States, really asking the question, what does it mean to be a digital citizen in a world that is changing vastly and quickly, where people still do the thinking, the writing, and the collaborative work. So on that note, I think I'm right on time, and I would like to say thank you.